Welcome to Intangibles podcast. I'm Steve BERG, your host. Success is driven by how as much as by what. How we communicate, how we lead, how we relate to our environment are all vitally important. Intangibles is a podcast that explores the underlying traits, qualities, and behaviors that improve the how. This is accomplished by finding the people who have studied and been successful practicing these soft skills and having informed conversations with them to get to what is learnable. Let's begin. You can't change the world alone. You will need some help. And to truly get from your starting point to your destination takes friends, colleagues, the goodwill of strangers, and a strong coxswain to guide them. Admiral William McRaven told this to the graduates of the University of Texas at Austin in 2014. It's good advice, particularly to a startup founder. In case you don't know what a coxswain is, that's the person in charge of navigating the boat, the leader. It's not a surprise that an admiral would use steering a boat as a metaphor for the humility and tenacity required for successful leadership. Despite the fact that my guest today was a cadet and not a midshipman, I expect that this son of a sea captain would abide by the admiral's sentiment. General David Petraeus has a long and distinguished career. He served in the Army for 37 years. Highlights, and this is not doing his career justice, include Commander of the International Security Assistance Force, 10th Commander, U.S. Central Command, and Commanding General Multinational Force, Iraq, where he successfully directed the surge and literally wrote the book on counterinsurgency. His educational credentials are stellar as well. BS from the U.S. Military Academy, top 5% in his class, MPA and Ph.D. from Princeton. After leaving military service, General Petraeus was the director of the CIA. These days, he is the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. General Petraeus, thank you for taking the time with me today, and thank you for serving our country.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be with you.
I imagine it must be somewhat surreal for you to listen to others list off your accomplishments so casually. What is it that you've achieved so far in life that you're most proud of?
Well, look, I've been very fortunate in a number of different endeavors over the years, and particularly fortunate to be part of great teams and in some cases to lead great teams. But I guess if you had to say what was the most significant, at the end of the day, it would have to be the surge in Iraq. When the surge was started, as you may recall, the situation in Iraq was really quite desperate. The country was on the verge of a full-blown civil war between the Sunni and Shia. It literally could have gone up in smoke. And the new strategy that we brought in, the new big ideas, and then the implementation by extraordinary soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians, all part of the Multinational Force Iraq and the U.S. Embassy under the extraordinarily capable leadership of Ambassador Ryan Crocker, turned this all around, together with our Iraqi partners, other coalition partners, to be sure. And over the course of the next 18 months, drove violence down by some 85 or 90%, and truly turned around a situation that had appeared headed for a very, very serious outcome.
Certainly, it's not too many people that can say that their greatest accomplishment is changing the course of history. I've read and listened to some of the more recent interviews on leadership, and I'm going to use that as the basis for my questions, and I'm going to dive right in if that's all right with you.
Sure.
Okay. You said while recording your Harvard Belfer Center discussions that the underpinning of strategic leadership is 4 tasks done perpetually. Number 1, getting the big ideas right. Number 2, communicating them effectively. Number 3, overseeing their implementation. And number 4, determining how to refine them and to do it again over and over and over. So I'm going to take those one by one. The first, getting the big ideas right. When we're talking about big ideas, what does that mean? Is that the vision, the direction, key decisions? Is it something else? How do you see the big ideas?
Well, they're all of that. But first, actually, let me just highlight that strategic leadership is really quite different. This is leadership in which an individual or a couple of individuals, if there are co-CEOs, as there are, in fact, in KKR, are making the decisions on the overarching direction, the overarching concepts, the truly, again, big ideas. They're literally deciding, again, whether to go straight, left, right, whatever it may be. And that is decided for the entire organization. And everyone, in a sense, underneath that level of top leadership is certainly, again, exercising very important tasks and very important leadership for his or her entity or organization. But at the end of the day, everyone else is exercising leadership within a context that is established by the strategic leader or leaders. And that does begin by getting the big ideas right. That is crucial. Frankly, if you don't get that right, everything else you do will be building on a shaky intellectual foundation. This, by the way, this applies whether it's a leader of a startup, that he or she is a strategic leader, all the way on up to, say, the leader of the multinational force Iraq during the surge, where we had 165,000 American men and women in uniform alone, about a like number of civilian contractors, and then tens of thousands of additional coalition partners, not to mention hundreds of thousands of Iraqi teammates as well. So again, this is really the crucial first step in strategic leadership. If this is not performed correctly, then the subsequent steps, as I mentioned, are going to be building on a foundation that could be akin to sand rather than concrete. And the next tasks are important as well. But if you don't get this one right, then all the rest of it is largely for naught. And for what it's worth, in the surge in Iraq, the big ideas were literally 180 degrees different from what we had been doing prior to the surge. I've often noted the surge of ideas was more important than the surge of forces, that we went from consolidating on big bases to living with the people again, because we believe that's the only way to secure them, from handing off the control of various areas to Iraqi security forces who could no longer handle the escalating level of violence, to taking that back over ourselves. From releasing detainees who in many cases just went right back into the fight, to removing the extremists from their midst and having a rehabilitation program so the recidivism rate was dramatically reduced. Embracing reconciliation because we realize that you can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. All of this is what provided the intellectual foundation, again, the big ideas for the surge. And had we not embraced those ideas, 25,000 additional forces added to nearly 140,000 Americans would not have predicted that you'd drive violence down by some 85 or 90%.
So I can imagine, you mentioned the co-founders or the co-CEOs of KKR. I can imagine that they get a chance to filter and assess a lot of big ideas in the course of their jobs. But where do the big ideas come from? What are the inputs? Yeah.
Generally, you want a process that is as inclusive as you can make it, because you want everyone in an organization to feel that he or she has had the opportunity to provide input. You want it to be transparent. It typically is iterative, so it evolves. And so in the case of the surge in Iraq, I was fortunate that we had a 15-month period where I was back in the United States between the 3- and 4-star tours, and a whole bunch of us had experienced what was going on, recognized we needed, for example, a counterinsurgency field manual. We spent a year or so developing that manual, and again, it was a very iterative process. It was a process of trying to distill the lessons that many of us had learned in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, and then that others had learned in previous experiences, whether it was in Oman or Malaysia or Vietnam, Indochina, Algeria, whatever the case. And so when we went back for the surge in Iraq, we had actually distilled the big ideas. We had developed them. And then I, as we'll talk about in a moment, communicated them. I actually had counterinsurgency guidance that I issued as the Multinational Force Iraq commander, and I can give you some examples of that. When it comes to KKR, they had some very big ideas at the very beginning, and they have continued to evolve. And of course, what you need is periodic action forcing mechanisms. And in this case, there have been partner meetings where they've actually said, let's go back and look at the really big issues with which we have to contend. Do you, for example, plow more into existing geographies, or do we seek opportunities in other regions? How big do we want to be in Asia? Do we try other parts of Latin America than we're already in? What about Africa? These are very fundamental decisions. Do we expand beyond the traditional areas of private equity, let's say real assets of real estate, energy, and infrastructure? By the way, the answer to that has been yes. What about getting into credit and capital markets? How about next generation technology? How about an impact fund? All of these have been the result of decisions by, again, the co-CEOs and the co-founders of KKR, Henry Kravis and George Roberts. And they have had the wisdom and the self-awareness, if you will, and the willingness to re-examine what it is that they're doing. And frankly, one of the areas in which I think they've been quite distinguished is the willingness to acknowledge that something is a mistake. There have been some regions in the world where we've said we're not going to invest there anymore. There have been initiatives that were started, tried, and didn't work out, and they shut them down. And the same should be true in any case. And of course, that's all the way at the final step, which is asking how do you refine the big ideas? And again, do it again and again and again. This task of getting the big ideas right, communicating them, overseeing their implementation, and then determining how to refine them. And it's a continuous. I can lay this out, for example, with Netflix. Reed Hastings has reinvented that company 4 different times, and hugely impressively in each case. And I've actually talked to him about this, and he essentially has these steps. And again, they have to be formal in certain respects. At a certain point in time, of course, you have to truly make decisions on the big ideas. You do have to communicate them, again, effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization. All the tasks involved, that sort of the traditional leadership tasks of overseeing the implementation, and then both informally and formally sitting down. And actually, in the case of the surge in Iraq, we had lessons learned team from the Army, the Marine Corps, the Joint Lessons Learned, the Special Operations Forces, the Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Counterinsurgency Center. And they would all funnel in, and on my battle rhythm, as we termed it, 1 hour a month was spent with the heads of these groups, laying out where they thought we needed to make changes to the big ideas, and then obviously to some of the subordinate ideas, if you will, as well. So you can see how this process plays out. And you can also see that it's very much applicable in the private sector, just as it is in the military or in other government organizations.
So as I'm listening to you, you're quite clear about pointing out the practical experiences that you gain along the way, but it seems like you keep going back to touch on the notion of applying critical thinking to those experiences as you kind of come to the conclusion that a big idea is in fact a big idea, and extrapolate that into the future, defining whether you think it will be successful or not. Do I have it right?
Absolutely. Critical thinking is crucial. And again, the question is always, how do you develop that? And I think you develop it through a combination of formal education. I remember that my experience in graduate school was very, very helpful in this regard. I remember professors saying this isn't exactly what critical thinking should be, and so forth. And you work on it, you improve it, you try to, again, learn lessons about how to do that. How do you distill an idea so it truly is a big idea? And again, I'll give you some examples of this in a moment from the counterinsurgency guidance that I've issued. And I would do it, by the way, about every month or two. I just sort of hit the send key and say, here's the latest version.
Yeah, you created a wiki, if I recall, right? You literally were adjusting almost in real time.
I was adjusting constantly.
Yeah.
It was always open as a document on my laptops.
Yeah.
The question is, when do you hit the send key? When have you actually changed it sufficiently? Or when have sufficient new units come in that it's time to just say, hey, here's the latest. Let's update this. But again, the critical thinking process here is absolutely crucial. I think you do it also by studying others. I think you obviously do it by exercising it yourself, by by experiencing under strategic leaders, how they perform it. So assignments where, for example, you are, as I was privileged to be, the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army, or the speechwriter for the NATO commander, or the executive officer for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. These are wonderful opportunities to observe individuals who are strategic leaders going through these four tasks, but in particular, again, that one about the big ideas, which again has to include the skill in critical thinking.
So quite recently, I did a podcast episode on storytelling. And we talked about the importance of incorporating emotion into the sales process. The thing about that is, while it might be an effective sales tool, it may not be an effective way to get the big ideas right. Would you at least spend a couple of moments explaining how you think about emotion and bias relative to big ideas as they come into focus?
Well, look, emotion and bias are very difficult to avoid, especially, frankly, if it is in a stressful moment, if you have lives literally on the line as you do in combat. And by the way, they also produce a fairly considerable amount of stress on an organization and on those who are privileged to lead it. But the same is true in any business. If the business goes through a particularly difficult time, again, that is a serious challenge. And there undoubtedly are a variety of different emotions that will accompany that kind of difficulty. And one has to both have this degree of determination, a degree of intellectual detachment, if you will, that you've got to try to remove the emotion from this. There's a whole variety of issues, again, that you have to confront when you are conducting the process of results in big ideas. The policymaking process, for example, can be one that's under enormous pressure. It can be, we have to do something. We have to respond in the wake of a huge, say, attack, the 9/11 attacks, a variety of other crises that our country has experienced and that certainly businesses have gone through. When you look at how different businesses and leaders responded to the events of the early months of the Great Recession, for example. And again, how do you steel yourself? How do you sit down and objectively try to determine what has transpired, why it transpired, and what the way forward should be? And you have to ensure that recent lessons, lessons of the past, as the title of a great book by Professor Ernie May at Harvard reminded us, that these can be particularly important. And you have to be careful that they don't become too important, particularly those experiences that were visceral. By the way, my dissertation in graduate school was on the American military and the lessons of Vietnam. And these lessons were so visceral that they continued in some respects almost to haunt those who experienced them personally, who went through them. And it was, the No More Vietnams was as powerful as perhaps more powerful than the No More Koreas, with both, if you will, good results in some respects. That's probably a healthy response, but also in some cases it can be overdone. I think it was Mark Twain who said that a cat that sits on a hot stove lid will never again sit on a hot stove lid, but it probably also won't sit on a cold stove lid. So the question is always, how do you distill the right lesson for the right situation, for the situation at hand, and understand the context and the contextual differences in that case from, say, previous cases.
Yeah.
And this is where, in a sense, I guess the art comes into this. And again, an awareness of how groupthink can afflict an organization, how you can, again, be overly dependent on very, very significant lessons that you've experienced or circumstances you've experienced, and so forth. That's all part of it when you're really in the kind of crunch that is decision-making in the wake of a crisis.
So it's interesting. I mean, I've always thought of it as being approached in two ways: either notionally strip out emotion and bias, or say, look, I can't strip out emotion and bias. I have to adjust for it as part of my management process. And it sounds like you, as you describe it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, it sounds like you opt for the former.
I think it's more that you have to be aware of the emotion.
I think that's right.
That you have to be aware of the impact of previous experiences. That you have to be aware of the potential of, again, groupthink. That all of this has to be in the back of your mind as ideas are being batted around and as policies are being formulated.
Let's move on to effective communication. In past interviews, you've emphasized repetition in communication, and which of course is obvious to me. That's always like my wife is a marketer, and I think of that as marketing 101. But I think that there's something in your past or a place that you garnered that as an important part of the effective communication process. Want to talk about this notion of repetition?
Yeah, look, I was, again, privileged to be the aide to a great chief of staff of the Army, General Carl Vano, during a particularly important period for the U.S. military. It encompassed the Operation Just Cause in Panama, and then Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait and Iraq, and a variety of others, I might add. And so this is a very, very active period. And during this, he had something he called the 6 imperatives. And I can still recite those in my sleep. And he had distilled in his first 2 years as chief into a white paper, which he referred to repeatedly in the final 2 years of his time as chief. Again, these 6 imperatives. And I took from that it really does matter. And so when I was a battalion commander in the great 101st Airborne Division, right after serving as his aide, I remember thinking to myself, I want the soldiers in this battalion, when they're asked 20 years later, what was Petraeus a nut about, not to have to think hard about it, that they should be able to recite the 5 big ideas, if you will. Again, noting I was not a strategic leader in this case. The strategic leader would have been several levels above me at least. But certainly I was making decisions within the context or the space established by the strategic leader. And so again, I set about determining what are the big ideas, and then how do you operationalize them? What does it really mean to say that we are going to emphasize physical fitness? What does that mean? What is the standard? What is excellence? What is the minimum standard? What happens if you don't meet the standard? Literally, how long a day are we going to do it? How do we adjust for that? What is the rhythm of the different activities that are going to comprise our physical fitness regime? How often do we do road marches? What is the standard for those? How do we promote competition? Because life is a competitive endeavor, and nothing is more competitive, obviously, than combat. And so in preparing for that, you're constantly, again, challenging your soldiers. And we certainly did that in our physical training. And we sought to win where we could, noting that you also sometimes have to recognize that you need to be the best team player, not just the best team or player overall. So again, this repetition is crucial. And in the case of the surge in Iraq, it started the very first day, right after I took the colors and handed them back to the command sergeant major and stepped to the podium for the few minutes that you say after you've assumed command. I emphasize the fact that we must secure the people, and we can only do it by living with them. I then gathered the commanders, who were all at the change of command ceremony, of course, and sat down with them and emphasized this again. And by the way, if you get the big idea, the really big ideas can be conveyed pretty simply. It is, we're going to live with the people. We got to get back into the neighborhoods. And we have ultimately, then they operationalize that. And for example, the division commander for Baghdad, area of responsibility, he established 77 additional locations in which our soldiers, generally also with Iraqi security forces, were located. We had to fight for most of those. And again, the enemy, we put them right in the fault lines between the different insurgent and militia and other groups. But that was the key. And then ultimately I published, we changed the mission statement, we changed the overarching civil-military campaign plan that the ambassador and I both signed. And then, as I mentioned earlier, periodically I would put out the counterinsurgency guidance. I would send letters to the troops. On the very first day, I sent a letter to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians of the multinational force, Iraq. But they constantly heard the same theme. And the very first one in the counterinsurgency guidance, so these were all a set of imperatives, and then I would explain it. So the first one is secure and serve the population. And then I explain the Iraqi people are the decisive terrain. Together with our Iraqi partners, work to provide the people security, to give them respect, to gain their support, and to facilitate establishment of local governance, restoration of basic services, and revival of local economies. The next one was live among the people. You can't commute to this fight, and so forth. Hold areas that have been secured. Don't just clear and then hand off. You have to clear and hold. Once we clear an area, we must retain it, and so on. Pursue the enemy relentlessly. Identify and pursue al-Qaeda, Iraq, and other extremist elements tenaciously. Don't let them retain support areas or sanctuaries. Force the enemy to respond to us. Deny the enemy the ability to plan and conduct deliberate operations. Employ all assets, so not just kinetic assets, employ all assets to isolate and defeat the terrorists and insurgents. Promote reconciliation. We cannot kill or capture our way out of this endeavor, and so on. So these go all the way through. I mean, some of these are really quite simple. Walk. Build relationships, promote initiative, manage expectations, be first with the truth. That was our guidance on public affairs. You know, you can't put lipstick on pigs. You avoid spin, let facts speak for themselves, and so on. So, you know, in this roughly 4-page document, it distills all that it is that we are trying to do in the direction that is necessary to do that. And, of course, is spelled out in much greater detail.
Sure.
But, again, when it's all said and done, you want someone to go back to those you were privileged to lead, ask what was this individual, again, a nut about, and hope that those you were privileged to lead will, you know, get 5 out of 5 or whatever it may be in a particular endeavor.
So you started out the answer with the word operationalize. And then you gave us actually a fairly operationalized list of how you wanted to proceed. Now, I think that in terms of effective communication, you've given us a fairly full-throated answer, but I also want to give you the room in the event that you want to talk about other things with regard to this. If you do, great. If you don't, that's fine. Also, things like clarity and simplicity in message.
Sure, it's crucially important. And you heard that. This is a set of
no more than 3 words, right?
Few words. Some of them are a little bit longer than others, but generally they are quite straightforward. And then there's an explanation. And so that's what we sought to do. And by the way, the last one was always learn and adapt, because we want to be a learning organization. We actually used to say that the side that learns the fastest prevails in this kind of fight. And that was a key element of the counterinsurgency field manual.
So I agree with that, even from the notion of startup founders as well, right?
Absolutely. And by the way, I should just note that, again, in addition to being a partner at KKR and the chairman of the KKR Global Institute and on a couple of the boards of companies that we own, I'm also a personal venture capitalist and invested in some 15 or so startups.
Oh, you made a mistake there, man. They're going to come pouring in now.
Well,
you think your inbox is full now.
But what I look for is great big ideas, very compelling big ideas, and then the ability of the leadership, not just to have come up with the big ideas, but of course to scale them, to operationalize them, as you say. And those qualities aren't always found in the same individual. And you have to have a founder who is sufficiently self-aware to realize that if he or she cannot scale it, there has to be a decision to bring someone in who can do that. Ideally, it's, of course, the same individual who comes up with the big ideas together with others and then leads the growth of the particular startup. But that's not always the case.
I agree. I on my list, I put intellectual honesty relatively highly. With regard to effective communication, poise and confidence in delivery, the how being as important as the what in your mind, or close?
Well, it's an element. Again, obviously, if you can't communicate clearly, concisely, effectively, compellingly, all the rest of that, then of course it is not going to be as good as it should be. And so, again, ideally, you have a leader who can distill the big ideas and also communicate them effectively. By the way, it has to be communicated through the breadth and depth of the organization. And so I was trying to ensure that the big ideas are echoed and re-echoed and also interpreted at each different level, so that all the way down to the individual soldier under body armor and Kevlar helmet outside the wire is, again, turning big ideas at my level into concrete action at those individuals' level. We used to call our young soldiers, in fact, and leaders, we would call them strategic sergeants and strategic lieutenants, because their actions at the tactical level could have strategic consequences, and in a number of occasions did. By the way, not always for the better.
Shall we move on to overseeing implementation?
Sure.
Great. Okay. So in what is often called the Petraeus doctrine on counterinsurgency, the quality of humanity, and you touched on this, frankly, early in our discussions, the quality of humanity seems to be an underpinning, particularly when it comes to winning hearts and minds, and and not only that, but kind of aligning people. Before I ask about humanity specifically as a component of leadership, would you agree that counterinsurgency, particularly on the civilian side, is about having respect for the differences and the needs and the goals of the other side?
Sure, certainly. And again, as I alluded earlier, the human terrain is often the decisive terrain. That doesn't mean that the Hindu Kush mountains are trivial in Afghanistan, or that the deserts of Iraq or the cities of Iraq are, again, not important. That context, that terrain, that physical terrain, man-made terrain is very, very important. But at the end of the day, a counterinsurgency is a fight for the people. You're fighting with the insurgents to try to get the support, the loyalty, the backing of the civilian population. And that is crucial. And, you know, you sort of have to like people, I think, in this business. I tend to think that leaders have to sort of like people to begin with. You can't sort of fake it. I mean, if you really don't care about those, then it's, again, at a certain point in time, your soldiers, your civilians, your members of a firm will see through that. And so, again, I think there has to be a sense of effort to understand, in the case of, say, Iraq or Afghanistan or other regions outside the United States, to understand the culture, the traditions, the ethnic, tribal, religious, political, and other entities, and to have respect for traditions that may be different from ours. And again, I think that one has to demonstrate this, and we work very, very hard to try to inculcate that understanding, that respect, and all the rest of that. And remember, as I said, it's not enough just to secure that. You have to serve the population. By the way, now keep in mind, this isn't just U.S., it's also increasingly over the course of a campaign, your host nation partners. Needless to say, the idea is not at the end of the day for us to win the hearts and minds, although that may be necessary in a short term, but eventually we want the host nation forces and governments to win the hearts and minds of their own people. What you're trying to do is to get the Iraqi people, as example, to support the new Iraq rather than to oppose it.
Yeah, how can they be aligned otherwise?
Exactly. But unfortunately, in the very beginning, early on after the invasion of Iraq, we actually took some policy decisions that created hundreds of thousands of opponents of what it was that we were trying to do. If you fire the military without telling them what their future is, and if you fire the Ba'ath Party, as much as the folks at the top needed to be killed or captured and then others need to be fired, but when you get down into the tens of thousands of a certain level, these are the bureaucrats, and you've just thrown them on the ash heap of history, because in a country like Iraq, there is no job outside of the government, at least for those in most of these different efforts. All universities there are state universities. Virtually every entity in Iraq could be traced eventually. Even the hotels were actually owned by the Ministry of Tourism and Trade. I mean, it took us a while to learn this. But so if you fire everyone down to a certain level, you have not got a reconciliation process. Again, I got it that there are certain, and we were frankly proud to kill the two sons of Saddam Hussein, Uday and Qusay, when they shot back at our soldiers when we tried to detain them. But at a certain level, you need folks to support you. And we used to ask a question about every one of our operations. This is another big idea operationally. Will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? And if the answer to that was no, then you should go sit under a tree until the thought passes, as we used to say. The same is true of a policy decision. And again, firing the military without telling them what their future was, and firing the Ba'ath Party members without a reconciliation process for those who could reasonably aspire to that, created enormous numbers of Iraqis whose future lay in opposing the new Iraq rather than supporting it.
You just increased your friction coefficient,
exactly.
Right?
And again, some of this wasn't resolved until the surge, when we did pursue reconciliation, when we realized again that you can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. You have to reconcile with the rank and file, by the way, while also pursuing the irreconcilables, the leaders of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the leaders of the major insurgent groups on the Sunni side, the leaders of the Shia militia, especially those supported by Iran. Those were irreconcilables, and they had to be either captured or killed or run off.
Understood. Okay. With this as the underpinning, and also trying to be respectful of time, I'd like to talk about some of the components that make up this humanity. And I know that you've touched on a couple, so we can do light touch on these. But your thoughts as to how each of the things that I'm about to mention kind of relates to your definition, your style of leadership. Integrity, trust. To me, it seems like that's the platform for effective leadership. The economy, democracy, it's the platform that everything rests upon.
Well, it's it's a very, very important component. Okay. Again, your troops have to have trust in you. You have to have trust. It's a two-way. It's right? A very two-way street. Yeah. You have trust in those who are in Washington. They have trust in you. Again, it's both up and down. Loyalty works up and loyalty works down. And they have to trust that you're going to keep their interests at heart, particularly if you are engaged in leadership of combat operations. They have to believe that you have got their interests, their lives, very much, and that you're fighting for the assets for them, and that you are conscious. I would meet with company command. We would go twice a week on my battle rhythm. We would, right after the morning update that we had every morning, it started at 7:30 and at about 8:30, we would then get in a armored vehicle or a helicopter or a plane even sometimes if we were going all the way north or south, and go and visit a unit. And ultimately, after a quick briefing on a hood of a Humvee, ideally, or a vehicle, so that you're not getting PowerPointed, you want to go out and see it for yourself, we would actually go on a patrol. And then at the end of that, I would always gather the captains who were commanding companies, because they were sufficiently experienced to have reasonably well-formed ideas, but still at a level where every casualty has a face, not just a name or a number. And they felt very deeply their obligation to their troopers, as I did, But I wanted to hear from them if there are issues that had not been resolved satisfactorily to them. By the way, I'd give them all my email, which you could get anyway. If you were on the military secure internet, you can get all the addresses. And I used to get a great deal of email from different levels. And I would tell them, if you are ever truly frustrated that your chain of command is not dealing with an issue that's very important to you, by definition, it's important to me, and let me know.
Yeah,
and
I recall you saying that specifically as it related to a civilian issue.
There
right?
were a number of issues,
yeah.
actually. It was across the board. And again, periodically, I would say once every week or so, or two, I would get an email from a captain with whom we'd visited, to whom I'd given my email address, and would say, hey, sir, I don't want to bother you, but this is a pretty big deal. We haven't gotten it resolved. I think you probably ought to be aware of it. And we would then try as best we could to treat it as an anonymous input and try to get it resolved. But again, that's what a leader has to do. And in addition to obviously providing energy, providing example, showing a willingness to share risk, share hardship, in some cases to lead, except when going through the chow line, as we used to say. We had a saying that it's hard to lead from the rear of the formation, which is another reason why physical fitness is not a trivial pursuit for those who are, again, under body armor and Kevlar helmet. And so all of these different activities, and to a degree creating, obviously you've got to show a personality, to try to, demonstrate, I don't know what you want to call it, charisma or inspiration or whatever it may be. But again, providing energy, example, and inspiration, these are three really important jobs of a leader in that task that is encompassed by overseeing the implementation of the big ideas.
Yeah. Well, you've touched on a good number of the ones that I wanted to talk about, but you were particularly forthright when it came to going first, and specifically as it results in the risks that one takes about being first to do anything, right? To show compassion, to do something that's dangerous, to meet a person halfway when you don't know the response of the person on the other side of the discussion. Perhaps if you can think of any, and I don't want to put you on the spot about this, any examples of situations where you had to go first for everybody else who is kind of around the table or on the other side of the argument to feel comfortable that they could have trust?
Well, again, it depends on the setting, and innumerable cases where everything from Ranger School, when I was a second lieutenant, and who's going to be first up the mountain when we were doing the mountaineering, and I'd volunteer to do that, and I'd try to be the first in a variety of different activities. Again, you got to be careful not to be the so-called spring butt, and constantly being me first or what have you. But when the tasks are tough, I think you've got to be more than shouldering your share of the burden. And
you mean as the leader, as the
I felt it was very important, even as a 4-star, to again go on patrols. Now, look, I don't want to misrepresent and say I was walking point for a rifle squad into some dangerous operations. That's not really where the strategic leader should be, obviously. But certainly, you've got to be out there enough to have a feel for the risks that these soldiers and Marines are taking, and we did that. And then at a certain point, I decided, for example, to take off my Kevlar helmet. You'll see pictures of me wearing a soft cap at about month 4 of the surge. And I thought, I had to show confidence in these guys. I still had body armor on, trust me. I actually, one time we did very high-risk live fire exercises as a battalion and a brigade commander and division commander. And I actually got shot one time. I took a round through the chest, an M16 round, and I was very lucky to survive. It was a result of an accident, sort of a freak accident. Soldier discharged a weapon after having knocked out a bunker and turned around back toward those of us who were observing the training exercise. But again, you got to be up there doing that stuff. And again, we did very, very high-risk training operations. We were among the few organizations that took seats out of helicopters because the seats are so ballistic. They provide enormous protection if you have
Yeah.
a very hard landing
Yeah.
or a crash. And so there's an understandable reluctance to take seats out in training. But our argument was, we're going to do that in combat. We better figure out how to do it in training.
Yeah.
But again, it required, I think, a 3-star general to approve it, or a post commander or something. And so we pushed that at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, when I was a battalion commander and the division operations officer with General Jack Keane, and then at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as a brigade commander when General Jack Keane was by then the corps commander and the post commander. So, but you've got to take these risks. And by God, I was in the helicopters with him. I mean, I remember the very first night that I was in command of the 101st Airborne Division, which is an air assault division, had 280 or 75 helicopters, something like that. We had 254 when we entered Iraq. That's an armada. But I remember that first night, I said, look, you guys got to find an air assault for me to go on tonight with the troops. I'm the commander of the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault. Let's do it. And we did. So after all the festivities were done, we put our camouflage on and hopped in the Humvee and went over to a pickup zone and joined a bunch of startled soldiers who had their division commander, their 2-star general, with them.
With their wide
eyes. We did that a
eyes.
lot. We ran PT with the troops, not out on our own, and especially, by the way, if it's raining and it's cold. And we tried to, again, inculcate a culture of not just of being a learning organization, but being of a tough organization mentally and physically.
Yeah. You just segued perfectly into the final of the 4 steps, which is refinement. In your current world, the adapting and the adjusting is akin, in my world, to product market fit. And I've heard you talk about this culture of learning before. You've mentioned it, I think, on a couple of occasions. Would you give us your methodology for refinement? And I know I asked for an example just a second ago. Any specific examples that you can think of how you've made those refinements?
Sure. Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Look,
Thank you.
Again, it wasn't just rhetoric that we wanted to be a learning organization. We incorporated action forcing mechanisms to make sure that we were trying to learn. I mentioned already the 1 hour a month that was devoted for the lessons learned team heads. But beyond that, we had, for example, every month, a few hours each month, we had all the commanders together for a commanders conference, 2-star level and above. Every one of those during his or her presentation had to give, I think it was the 2 initiatives or big ideas or lessons that he or she had learned in the previous month that would be generally applicable to all. So again, every activity we did, there was a requirement. This is not optional. You had to constantly share big ideas. And I even did, when I was a 2-star division commander in Iraq, for example, during the first year after the fight to Baghdad, we then moved up to Mosul. And we had a daily conference call with all of the subordinate commanders, the brigade commanders, and then the separate commanders as well. And I would constantly, I was, in a sense, we, with quotes, called it screwing with the commanders, because, you'd have the 1st Brigade commander who would typically go first, and he'd say, well, today we inaugurated the western Nineveh Civilian Council. And I say, hey, that's fantastic. So 2nd Brigade, what have you done? And you say, well, I have the Tigris River Valley Council. And then, okay, 3rd Brigade Commander, what have you got? And you say, well, I have the Mosul Council. Again, but what you're doing is you're promoting the idea that we should be constantly not just coming up with new initiatives, but sharing them, and to a degree competing with each other. I might add, I was incredibly fortunate with the 3 infantry brigade commanders that we had during that first year, all of whom were there for the whole first year in Iraq. Every one of them ultimately made 3 stars. So these were some gifted individuals, and that's one reason, a very important reason, that the first year in Iraq went reasonably well for the 101st Airborne Division in the northern part of the country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that is the leadership framework. I want to test it a little bit. And you actually even alluded to some of this earlier, so you're not going to be surprised by any of this. What happens to a leader, and what happens to this framework in particular when we start to put pressure on it? When it's, as you mentioned, life or death pressure, when it's time constraint pressure, in my world, when it's capital constraint pressure. What separates success and failure in these moments?
Well, it's a variety of qualities that might be captured by the words fortitude, resilience, determination. That's what is required, obviously, when the going gets particularly tough. And what you do in military units and in leader development courses and all the rest of that, you're trying to put pressure on people. Ranger School, as an example, is a leadership course really at heart, but it tests leaders under enormous pressure. You're very, very tired, you're worn out, you're endless hours under a rucksack. Back in our day, which was not very healthy, and they eventually started it, but you actually had one meal a day for the final week or so, and you had actually quite substantial weight loss. But again, the idea was, let's put these leaders under the greatest pressure we can without breaking them, and have them experience that. But this continues all the way up to the 2- and 3-star level. There are computer war games, and the idea is to put stress on the commander and on the commander's principal staff members and subordinate leaders. It's certainly true at the battalion and the brigade level. When you go to the National Training Center or the Joint Readiness Training Center, they're literally, again, they're forcing you to respond to all kinds of unexpected challenges. Enemies that are really, really competent, that know the ground, that plant improvised explosive devices, civilians on the battlefield who are demanding things, again, insurgents, main units, air defenses, jamming, you name it. They want to confront you with every possible situation in peacetime training, so that when you actually go downrange. I had one that I really pushed very, very hard as a brigade commander, where you have the assets to do it, then as a division commander, again, as a colonel and a 2-star. And this was that we didn't do combined armed live fire exercises that were scripted. I said, this is nonsense. I mean, just put the guy, let him sit up against a tree and just call it in on his radio. If you're giving him a script to read, all that trains him to do is, again, read and press the handset on a radio. I want the individual to respond to unexpected situations. So we would literally clear a mile or so into an actual impact area where you'd had a lot of indirect fire. So you surface clear it so you can walk into it. And then you can shoot indirect fire systems all around yourself. And we would have 60 millimeter mortars, 81 millimeter mortars, heavy mortars, 120s in some cases, 105 howitzers, 155 millimeter howitzers. Occasionally, we'd even have attack helicopters. And they didn't know what was going to confront them because we didn't know. I would walk with every company commander in a brigade combat team, as an example. And so this could be as many as 15 or 16 of them. And then you had others walking with their platoon leaders. By the way, we didn't have the troops out there. I said, we're not going to have troops be training aides for untrained lieutenants and captains. We want them to be competent before we do that. But they would just start walking in actual doctrinal formation, spread about as you would be in a normal formation for that type of mission. And then we'd say, okay, you see that orange painted Hulk out there, usually old tanks or something, and we'd repaint them. And we'd say, okay, that's actually not that. That's actually an enemy unit that doesn't yet observe you of this description. What do you do now? And the individual has to consider all these different factors about what weapon system could be brought to bear most quickly, what would be most effective, what fuse type, what radio net is that system available on. Do you use a an existing target, or do you call in a new fire? I mean, it's really quite complex. In fact, we used to have what we called Fire Support Olympics the day before, just to refresh people's memories on all the radio net structure, the capabilities of the different system, the fuse types, the round types. And it was, again, very, very challenging. And this was not what virtually any other unit did until this word started to spread, how effective this was. And the reason I explain this at some length is that I remember walking with a battalion commander as we're doing the first big fight of the 101st Airborne Division. We're converging on the holy city of Najaf, about 500,000 or 600,000 people in southern Iraq, home to the famous Gold Dome Mosque there, and the tomb of Imam Ali, the holiest site in Shia Islam. And as we are moving into the city, I said, well, what's it been like? Colonel is Bill Hickman, a really extraordinary individual, who's now a 2-star, who was with me 3 more times working directly. And he said, sir, this is just like the walk and shoot that we practice, because that's what it was. He was being confronted by unexpected situations, and his leaders then had to determine, what do we do? Do we use our direct fire weapons? Do we use our indirect fire systems? Do we use attack helicopters? We had 2 different types, light and heavy. Do you call in a bomb from an Air Force system? And again, because they had been confronted with this in training, as opposed to the kind of scripted activity that so many of the combined arms live fire exercises were, because of that, they were prepared to respond to this. And it was really a wonderful moment to realize that the training that we had pushed so hard had actually proven to be pretty effective in helping them be prepared for the fights that we encountered.
What a fantastic answer. I hesitate to even ask the other test that I was going to do it because that was just so helpful. I'm going to do it anyway. The leadership framework that we discussed, the 4 steps.
4 tasks.
4 tasks.
4 tasks, in particular of a strategic leader, although others really do those as well, just not quite the strategic nature of the decisions they're making. But it's still very important to determine, as a battalion or a brigade or a division commander, what are your 5 or 4 or 5 or 6 big imperatives?
The things that come to mind about that framework is that because they're so systematic, there's a couple of things that I'm curious about. You've said in the past that there's no such thing as a fixed leadership style. My experience is
there shouldn't be.
Well, there shouldn't.
Again,
right.
the idea there, the big idea here is that I used to explain it that when people would say, well, how would you describe your leadership style? And I'd say, I'll describe my leadership style if you describe the style that's required to bring out the best in each of those who report directly to me individually, and to provide the best leadership possible for the organization overall. So in other words, the leadership style as a rompin', stompin' airborne rifle platoon leader, as I was privileged to be as a 2nd lieutenant, is very, very different from that which you employ when you're leading, say, a large organization like the CIA or the Multinational Force Iraq. And again, each of us responds to different styles, and the key is to find what is best for him or for her.
Yeah. So you're 2 steps ahead of me, of course, here. I'm not surprised by that. You've got a fluid environment. You've got no fixed leadership style. The question then is, when you look at the folks that report to you directly, how do you assess the leadership style that's actually going to work best? Well,
it's sort of, in a sense, by experimentation. I mean, does this person need lots of guidance or not? What's interesting is if you asked folks whom I was privileged to lead, say, during the surge in Iraq or surge in Afghanistan or what have you, you'll find some that would say, gosh, he was the most hands-off guy I've ever worked for. He very light hand on the reins, really let us have our head, gave us the guidance and then let us get after it. And then there are others that will say, God, he was the biggest micromanager I've ever worked for. Well, I'd like to think that the reason that the difference was expressed was because one didn't need any guidance and the other needed perhaps a lot of it. By the way, that doesn't mean that they're not great, in a sense, subordinate leaders, depending on, of course, the results they're achieving and so forth. It's just that some folks, because of experience, because of expertise and so forth, really get it immediately, and all you have to give them is, again, a few words. We're going to live with the people, and they got it. And then others just haven't had that same level of experience and expertise and need a little bit more explanation, perhaps a little bit more guidance, a little bit more. So I've noted, for example, that out of 9 infantry battalion commanders in the great 101st Airborne Division who were the principal ground commanders, if you will. Now, there were lots of others. There were engineers, there were aviators, there were logistics, signal. We had probably 50 some odd battalions in this division task force of 20 to 25,000 soldiers during the course of that year. But of the 9 infantry battalion commanders, 2 or 3 really did not immediately embrace the need for the other tasks of a counterinsurgency campaign. So they're terrific at offense and sometimes defense if you needed it, but not quite as good at the so-called stability operations component. That's where you're, again, working with the people. That's where you are trying to help restore basic services. You are trying to establish local dispute resolution mechanisms, to create local governance, to get markets going again, to repair damage done during the fighting or looting. All of these other tasks, once you have a security foundation, it's the performance of those tasks that actually solidify the security foundation and actually improve it and then build on it. Because, of course, it's, the people are constantly asking, am I better off now than I was before? Who is it that I should embrace? To whom should we give our loyalty and support? At the end of the day, we wanted that to be the new Iraq, not the old Iraq or some group that's fighting the new Iraq. So you can see the concept here. And again, those 3 that didn't really get it immediately got a bit more guidance and a bit more coaching, mentoring, teaching. Ultimately, they all did. And, of course, it was by no means just me. I mean, each of them had a brigade commander. We had a chat with him. We had an assistant division commander for operations who would sit down with him, and ultimately I would sit down. And usually by the time I arrived, after having shared my observations with the brigade commander and the one-star general, they were absolutely embracing this stuff and worn out from doing it, and realized that the essence of what it was that they needed to do at their level at that time in this effort was not be out on every raid every night. It was to be focusing on the tasks that solidified the results of the security operations that we'd already conducted.
Super helpful. I am going to ask the final 3 questions. So we're almost at the end. They're a little bit shorter, but I wanted to let you know that we're kind of near the end here.
Okay.
Question number 1, is there something about leadership that you would like to address specifically that we didn't cover in our discussion?
I guess there are 2 topics that I might discuss quickly. The first is what might be termed affirmative leadership. I always felt that was generally better than what might be termed, negative leadership or what have you. Affirmative leadership is I say, hey, Steve, I am looking forward to seeing that report on my desk on Monday. I've heard it's going to be awesome. I mean, the troops are already talking about it. I don't know if I'll be able to sleep Sunday night. I'm so excited about getting it. You've just now, in a very affirmative manner, in a positive manner, reminded you that you better have, and how much better than saying you better have that darn report on my desk by noon on Monday or I'll have a piece of your backside. You've got the same degree of pressure on you, maybe even a bit more, because you don't want to let the leader down. But it always seemed to me that was an approach, at least it was one that I appreciated, rather than somebody poking me in the chest and saying, again, you better do this or else. And then the other has to do with what do you do with somebody who is just not measuring up? You're familiar with the Peter principle that all of us are promoted one level above the level of our competence. And that point does arrive, and you have people working for you who are not quite at the level of performance that you would want for that particular position. And so we're not talking here about malfeasance or someone who has performed some particularly reprehensible action. you're talking about somebody that just doesn't quite meet the standard that you need for the performance of a task. And my view was always, I didn't believe in what might be termed public executions. I didn't believe in making an example of someone who was doing the best that he or she could, and just at that level no longer was, again, measuring up. And it seemed to me that we're all human beings. We all want to preserve our dignity and respect. And there's a way of allowing someone, say, to return home early or to move on to some other position before was expected, without destroying them and their family. Now, this doesn't mean you don't alert the system to the fact that this individual perhaps shouldn't be promoted further, perhaps should not lead again, perhaps should be allowed to actually retire or what have you. But why do damage to an individual? And again, if he or she is doing the best that they can, it just never struck me as something that you should, again, make something very public about this. Certainly in some other cases that is necessary. So yeah. I think those two aspects of leadership I've always felt are pretty important as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Question number 2, you mentioned Lessons of the Past by Ernie May. My question is going to be, what books, and I would assume that's one of them, or materials do you hold in particularly high regard on the topic of leadership?
Well, I think just the category of biographies. I think we can learn a great deal by studying those who came before us. And if you're a military officer and you're trying to be prepared for something that could come down the road, that you ought to read about how others performed important tasks prior to you. There's this saying that we always stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and there's some pretty big giants among the ranks of those who served prior to us putting on the uniform or taking on any task in the civilian sector as well. And it seems to me that we should try to understand how they tried to perform their duties as leaders. I'm particularly fascinated with Grant, by the way, in part just because history was so unkind to him for a good bit of the previous century, but his reputation rightly has been restored quite considerably. There are 2 books on Grant just in recent years, for example, one by Ron Chernow of Hamilton fame, and then also by Ron White, who titled his book beautifully, I thought, American Ulysses, which is how I do regard U.S. Grant. By the way, a guy who was brilliant, uniquely brilliant. I don't think there's any other U.S. Army general in history who was brilliant at the tactical level, at the operational level, and at the strategic level. Tactically in the Land Between the Lakes campaigns as a 1-star, I believe it was, multiple brigades under him. Operational at Vicksburg, one of the great high-risk maneuver battles of all time, so risky that his most trusted subordinate, General Sherman, insisted on a letter being put in the official file that he thought it was too risky. And then, of course, strategically, when he's the first after 8 or so had failed before him, including McClellan twice, to develop an overarching strategic campaign. That's where he was the strategic leader. And he developed the overarching big ideas of Sherman, you're going to come out of Chattanooga, go to Atlanta, Savannah, and then north up the coast. Sheridan, you're going to come down the valley and pick it so clean that the granary that used to be for the Southern Confederates, a crow could not find a crumb. He had a couple of different generals coming out of the Tidewater area, never particularly effectively, but putting pressure, again, on Richmond and the lines of communication to the south of Richmond as well. And then Meade, you go where Lee goes, and Grant sat in Meade's back pocket and had a very unique relationship with him where he was often giving direction to those who were actually part of Meade's army. And yet they worked all this out between them. And, of course, they pursued Lee until ultimately all the way until Appomattox. So, again, this is what you can take. I was reading a great book by Bruce Catton, published a number of years ago, Grant Takes Command, during the surge. And I remember thinking, my gosh, this is so instructive. He went through these same kinds of challenges. Obviously, I'm not comparing the surge in Iraq with the American Civil War, but again, if you were in a strategic leadership position and you are the person it's pretty instructive to revisit how others have exercised strategic leadership before you. Churchill by Andrew Roberts, another recent and great biography that I found just enormously instructive. And talk about a communicator. Churchill may be almost unequaled and just an incredibly prolific and very eloquent, almost lyrical writer, and very, very extraordinary, effective leader, albeit with some particular traits and
individualities.
He certainly had some individualities.
All right, final question. Is there any message on any topic, actually, that you would like to communicate to the people responsible for building, or at very least navigating the future?
Yeah, I guess I might leave this interview by just noting that it's important to recognize that luck does play a role. Timing is not trivial, it's not insignificant. But it's important to remember that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And that leaders, again, have to keep learning. They keep studying. They keep experiencing. They keep watching others. They keep preparing. You could train your entire life. You could prepare for an entire life and never have a surge in a rock opportunity. Indeed, there's been one in my generation's lifetime, if you will. And luck played a significant role in terms of timing and so forth, that I was privileged to command the surge in Iraq. But I'd like to think that I was prepared for it to the best of my ability, at least, that I'd spent a lifetime truly trying to understand the nature of the war in which we were engaged, to understand, again, the big ideas that were necessary to pursue as our strategic direction, and the concepts, and then all of the other tasks of how to communicate, how to oversee the implementation, and how to distill the refinements to the big ideas and do it all over again and again and again, with lots and lots of subtasks in each of those big four tasks of a strategic leader. And again, the truth is that huge opportunities may or may not present themselves, but if they do, you want to be absolutely prepared to fully capitalize on them and to discharge your responsibilities if you are indeed privileged to lead a particularly important endeavor.
So what I've studied about you and what I know of your life, I fully believe that's true. General Petraeus, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Steve.
It's really been a great honor for me. I appreciate your participation. I appreciate the time that you've committed to this. And I would say, again, thank you for your service to the country.
Well, that was a privilege.
This has been Intangibles. You can find this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and many other podcast platforms. You can also find it at its home on the web, which is www.intangiblespodcast.com. I'm Steve BERG. Thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode.